So my name's Rachel Pritchard. I work in DELWP's Natural Environment Program in the Bowen South West region, and I'll be your host for the first part of today's session. So I'd like to thank you for joining us and making the time to hear these fantastic talks that we've got today. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm joining you from, the Gunditj Mara people, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that today we're highlighting the incredible land management programs, biodiversity and threatened species research that is being undertaken on Eastern Maar Country. And I'd like to pay my respects to the Eastern Maar people and their elders, past, present and emerging. Our first presentation, which will be coming up shortly, will be from Billy Briggs and Paul Kelly, representing the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation. Because we're all coming together online today, I'd also like to extend my acknowledgement to the traditional owners of all the lands that you're joining us from today, and any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people who might be online with us today. So a little bit of a technical direction for how today's going to work. So attendees won't have access to their cameras or microphones, just to keep things moving smoothly. So when the presentations are on, if you have questions or comments you'd like to make, please make them in the chat function. You'll see on the screen that Louise is sharing a highlight showing you what icon to look for to access the chat function. So please make sure what you put in there is relevant and respectful. You'll see if you hover over something in the chat, some little tools pop up and there's a thumbs up is one of the things that pops up. So if somebody else has typed in a question that you'd like to hear the answer to, if you hit that thumbs up symbol, then as host, I'll be able to see which questions there are many people wanting to hear the answer to, and I'll prioritise those when we get to the time to ask questions of the speakers. Any questions that we don't have time to get a verbal answer from, I'll ask the presenters to type their answers into the chat after their question and answer session is finished, or if they're busy listening to another person, I'll get them to spend a bit of time in the break just going through the chat and answering any questions relevant to their talk. So that's how questions are going to go. I'm just checking my notes for anything else technical I should give you a heads up for. So hopefully you can see in the chat, and Lou might copy it back in there in case you can't see what was in before you joined us. She's given us her mobile phone number into the chat. So if you have any technical issues during today, you can call or text Lou and she'll see what she can do to help you. So I will ask when we get into things that only those speaking have their cameras on so that we can see the face of presenters, and I'll have my camera on when I'm facilitating as well. So you'll only have the video feeds from people who are speaking. I will do my best to keep us to time. So for those of you who are presenting, you've got 10 minutes to talk and 5 minutes of question time. At 10 minutes, I'll turn my video back on so I can give you the eye and let you know that you're now starting to eat into your question time. At 12 minutes, if you gave no signal that you noticed I was giving you the eye, I will maybe say something to make sure that you know that you're now at the 12-minute mark, so that you definitely have time to at least get to your key points before the 15 minutes is up. Hopefully you finish before 15 minutes, and that gives us time for you to verbally answer some of the questions that people have posted in the chat. So we can have a couple of minutes here or there, but hopefully we can keep mostly to time so that everybody gets their fair share of the day. So I think that's all I had to cover in this little bit. So I will throw to Billy and Paul for our first presentation from the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Wow, look, this has been the first official welcome to country, but to virtual country we'll be doing now. So before we start and kick off the forum, in language, say na tonwa, na tuk lingong linga, pikrong, kirong, mereng, gunijmara, japarong. So, hello and welcome. My name's Paul Kelly. My totem is the linga, the kite hawk. So the kite hawk was my totem given to me by some elders, Framlingham, back when I was a child. And when you're given a totem, that's the way of caring for country. You can't hunt this totem in particular, and this is sort of how we care for country. Now, all my mob come from like Framlingham, Warrnambool, or Southern Garrywood, where I'm coming from today, actually, in Jabberong country. And actually, to continue to welcome the country, I'll extend through to Billy as well to say his bit. Then, we'll chuck in a bit more pieces here and there.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks, Paul. G'day everyone. It's Billy Briggs from the Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation. Me and Paul Kelly, we work variously around the biodiversity landscape, but in our sense, the cultural biodiversity landscape. So really trying to help everybody sort of understand the implementation of what the cultural biodiversity landscape looks to us in a sense of cultural significance to the landscapes and your flora and fauna. Basically here today just to sort of get a scope and idea of what everybody has to offer and hopefully get out of it in a sense of what everybody understands of what it's like on Maar Country and what Eastern Maar as I guess you could say as a body corp would like to see and what we're interested in. And yeah, so it's not really a presentation, but it's more just like an introduction. But yeah, hopefully we could get a lot of stuff out of it. Yeah.
As you know, as Eastern Maar as well, we're still developing our resources here and there as well. We're not, I don't know about Billy himself, but we're not really up to date with the video presentation kind of stuff. We're out there on country a lot. We don't work 9 to 5. We're 24/7, continuing our culture, as in walking our ancestors' footprints. The way we use and care for country as well, is it could be anything from the silhouettes in the hills, characteristics of wildlife. For example, the cockatoos, chin up. We know that's going to be the cold time, so we find ways to prepare to survive on country around then. So back in the days, we'll catch an emu. If it's really cold, the emu in the back of the oils in the back of the neck will melt down, rub on your body to help keep you warm. There'll be some trading involved as well. Some eel or some greenstone, some possum skin cloak. We also know that when the butterflies come out, this is going to be hot, so we start to prepare to make some coolamins or something like that to collect a lot of the berries for our survival. And then we know that the eels are going to come up later on, late summer, etc., etc. This morning I had so much everything that we say, it's not scripted. We say from the heart and from our experiences. And yesterday I had my second jab, so I'm a little bit cloudy this morning, but I really do look forward to hearing everybody's presentation, and what we can all share together, and so on. Anything to add, Bill?
No, not so much. I think I just want to reiterate, sorry, my stuff around like cultural biodiversity landscape. It's sort of for people that don't understand what that could mean initially. It's like all of our country, Maar Country, not just like specific to us as traditional owners, but it'd be the same for all mobs around Victoria and Australia wide, that we have our cultural dreaming stories, and effectively most of those dreaming stories attached to that landscape or intangible cultural heritage. So the usage of native plants and different kind of species are highly important, because it understands it helps you understand from our perspective of what that was used for and how to use it, and then that could sort of give you an idea of how that landscape was managed. I won't blabber on, but there's a couple of dream stories out there related to Mount Warrion, Warrior language is the Eastern Maar Country, and there's a dream story that's attached to that, and effectively it's the aim of that story is to keep the abundance of the Eastern Maar Country. But so there's your management plan, because you could sort of be like, okay, well, bandicoots eat this, they need this type of habitat to live in, this is how they react to fire. It's all those key issues that help you manage country, that help you understand, and yeah, that's all I've got. So yeah.
Yep. And now look, some of the words we can learn from today from the Eastern Maar is Natamwa or Nara, okay, for a hello or welcome or a greeting. And for the word thank you, okay, you'll see that we'll spell it TDO. Looks like to-do, but it's not, it's tool. If you forget how to say that, just remember how you used to call your brother or sister a tool. Okay, it's very similar, tool. And for goodbye, for later on, if you want to learn to say it, is wuruk or nakanya. Okay, a bit of that exchange there.
Sorry, Paul, I just see a question come through from Louise. Hey, Billy and Paul, just wondered, do you have any specific interest in the natural environment within the Maar Country? Example for birds, species, or waterways, or certain plants. To sort of touch on that, like, I'm not massive. I know the different types of, like, we, for instance, you know, when we do dancing, we have a dance that resembles each bird. In particular, it would be it's like your I don't know the names. You're gonna have to help me out here, Paul. You know the language. Rural,
the Belga, all of the live bird dance and that. And yeah, there's a ground parrot dance as well that I'm trying to find that one again. I remember doing it once. You know, we even do the whale dance when the whales come through.
But yeah, to sort of narrow down the answer to the question, we have high interest in native birds. You know, high interest in natural waterways and natural springs, and you know, and from an array of plants, like, you know, obviously your native plants, and you know, because one example, you know, your chocolate lily, you know, you could eat that plant, and for everybody that didn't know, you could eat it from in spring, early spring, just before the flower sprouts. You pull the root base out and you can just chew on it. And that, I've never tasted it, but I've heard it tastes as sweet as it smells. So yeah, so that hopefully that gives everyone a better idea as well.
All right, I'm going to practice your word. Is it, so I was going to say thank you, but is it tool? Like, is it tool, but I don't quite say the L so clearly.
That sounds really good. Yes.
Yeah, so
sounds better than me.
it's spelled TDO, but
yeah.
So the D's obviously silent. So yeah, just tool. Like just let it roll off the tongue, like tool.
Tool.
Yep. So you'd be aware that, you know, we had no written information, so that's why these landscapes and the everything that lives on it or around it is so important to be preserved and well looked after. Same as the rock art that you will find in some of the shelters and that. That's our dictionary. That's our story, and then we filter that through our dancing and lots of verbal information there as well, and through the trade. So the whole country is so important to us. Yeah.
So before we move on quickly, Rachel, just one more thing to add. I just want to sort of point out the fact too that me and Paul Kelly's knowledge in-house and as traditional owners and community members as well, our knowledge around culture and, you know, all the stuff that we sort of just shared down, that's just a part of what's out there. You know, effectively, Eastern Maar, we're just the voice for our community members. You know, a colleague of mine, our manager, John Clark, always says to us, like, it's like a massive puzzle piece. You know, everybody holds a piece of that puzzle. When you bring it together, it brings the bigger picture together. That sort of gives you a better understanding that, you know, we don't know everything. Like PK interpret a piece of country completely different to what I would interpret it, and that's how we relate to that individually as an Aboriginal person or a traditional owner. So yeah. Sorry, Rachel, you're on mute.
Look at that. I'm supposed to be the one reminding other people to unmute. So we do have a few more minutes if anyone's got any questions for Billy or Paul. I noticed that Tracy's mentioned it'd be great if this could become part of school curriculum, and I'm lucky my daughter at Narrawong gets to learn word Rodung, and she comes home and will teach me words and laugh at me when I can't say them correctly. And I know, the schools in our area have been really proud of that, but it's, it was a big project to be able to get to the point of that being able to occur in schools. I hope it occurs as a rolling project on different country, working with different traditional owners. So I'll just give people time to see if they've got any additional questions or anything else that they're interested to hear from you guys.
Yeah,
Yeah, go.
Sorry, I was just going to quickly talk to that. I'm sure that like I know there is some local language that's being taught in a preschool setting locally by some community, which is great because that's where you sort of learn the most of your words at a younger age. But as a part of a school curriculum, I think that'll be sort of implemented highly by treaty. For everybody that doesn't know what treaty is, you can look it up. That's probably what treaty could mean to us as Aboriginal people, is having Aboriginal culture and language and certain extent of things taught in a school curriculum. You get graded on it and stuff like that. And so I think we're slowly moving towards it. Probably another 6 or 5 years, who knows? But it's definitely a lot closer than what it would have been 20 years ago. Yeah,
absolutely. It's an exciting thing to start to see movement going in a positive direction there. So Stuart's made the comment, memory must be such an important part of keeping culture. Explain? ?
Yeah, I'm not sure if I really understand your question there, Stuart.
You might need to type a little more, Stuart. Tracy's wondering if you've got any books or references on culture that other people might be able to tap into, or do we just tap into your brains?
There's no real particular books on, like specific stuff around our culture. I mean, you had your people that would have come here around the European settlement and pre-European contact and stuff like that. There's a book you could refer to as James Dawson. It really talks to the South West people of like the Indigenous people of these areas. His interactions and stuff like that. But I wouldn't know any books that really refer particularly to our stuff. Like all the knowledge that me and PK know, that's a privilege of being passed down from our older generations. Just talking to older people in the community, uncles, aunties. It's how it would have been. Like we would have been taught the stuff from a kid, but it's sort of done in a different setting now. Like, if I want to know something, I'll go talk to Uncle Rob. Hey, can you tell me about this, please? Or, whatever happened here? Or do you know anything about this area? And he'll talk to you and he'll tell you. But he'll only give you a little bits at a time too. So, that's how we sort of learn, I guess. And, you never stop learning. Like, we'll keep learning until, till that's our last day, really. Like, it's a massive learning. It's a life journey.
Yeah, beautiful. And I think Stuart clarified just that his memory for language is crap, and how do you remember? But I suppose that might be true of every multilingual person.
There's you can talk too, PK. There's other numerous sources out there for some basic words in language, like nyata or nyatamwa, or Natuk and all those words. You can find them in the Dawson book. There's some references in that, and it sort of tells you what language group it comes from. Like, to give it in perspective, the Pikrong language has got 6. It's made up of 6 sub-dialects. So it's not just the one language. Like, there was 6 sub-dialects in that language group, which is pretty crazy to put in perspective. But there's some basic words out there, and it's sort of, I found, like, with a lot of the words, like, your wurrong. Like if you can roll your R, terrific. You know, you're going to be an expert at it. But you know, it's really word of mouth. How does it sound in your head? You know, type thing.
Yeah, it's a different thing for a language that wasn't originally a written language. It's probably a different way of thinking for us. So if you guys are happy, I'm going to move on to the next person. You might want to keep an eye on the chat, and if there's anything there you want to type responses to, go for it. And I'll ask you guys to turn off your cameras as well as your microphones. And talk again for joining us and sharing your perspectives on biodiversity on country. Okay, so I'm going to throw to Dan, who is now popping up on our screen. So Dan is from Birdlife Australia, and he's going to be talking to us about hooded plover recovery on Eastern Maar Country. So just for participants to be aware, sometimes it takes half a minute or so for the presentation to pop up on your screen. So it tended to work pretty well Tuesday, but sometimes there was a short delay. There you go, Dan, it's up and ready to go. I'll disappear until you're running out of time.
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Paul and Billy, for an excellent presentation. So as Rachel said, my name's Dan Lees. I work for Birdlife Australia as the Coastal Project Officer, and today I'm going to be talking about hooded plover population recovery on Eastern Maar Country. So just to quickly introduce you to the species. So the hooded plover is separated into two subspecies, an eastern subspecies and a western subspecies, with the delineation sort of around the Nullarbor. As any of you have been to the Nullarbor can sort of attest to, the Nullarbor is several hundred kilometres of sheer cliffs that go straight into the water, and that seems to be acting as a dispersal barrier for these sort of coastally dependent birds, thus separating the two subspecies. So in total, the population's between 5,000 and 6,000 birds across both subspecies, with the eastern subspecies actually being listed under the EPBC Act as vulnerable in 2014. So the eastern subspecies and the western subspecies differ slightly. So the western subspecies actually looks a tiny bit different. You can see from the comparison here of the picture that I just popped up that when you compare the eastern to the western subspecies has substantially more black on the top of its back when compared to the eastern, and it differs a bit more behaviourally as well. Whereas the eastern species is almost exclusively nesting on ocean beaches, the western subspecies will actually fly and land to some of their inland sort of salt lake, salt marshy areas and actually nest and live in there, whereas again the eastern subspecies is all but exclusively confined to ocean and occasionally bay beaches in the eastern states. So some of the best and most important habitat for hooded plovers is actually Eastern Maar Country. As many of you who have been down to the beaches in Eastern Maar Country would have realised, there's a lot of on and offshore basalt rocky reefs, and these rocky reefs provide a lot of seaweed or beach wrack that then washes up onto the shore and is an absolute haven for invertebrates like sandhoppers, flies, march flies and their larvae, and a whole host of other invertebrates that hooded plovers eat. And this host of invertebrates has made Eastern Maar Country in sort of specifically the densest population of hooded plovers in the entire country. So in other parts of Australia and Victoria, you have to walk potentially kilometres in between breeding territories, whereas on Eastern Maar Country you can have overlapping territories. And just to give you an idea of that, there's about between 600 and 700 hooded plovers in Victoria, and around about 100 of those are just on Eastern Maar Country. And when you think about Eastern Maar Country in terms of the rest of Victoria, that's an absolute massive amount of the population when compared to the rest of Victoria in one small area. And that's because of that amazing habitat resource. It's also a really important wintering or flocking location, and the densest flocks of hooded plovers, or the largest flocks of hooded plovers ever recorded, have actually been at Kelly Swamp. So they'll come together in these huge flocks of the largest ever a couple of years ago, 102 individual birds, and there's a photo just here, roosting during winter in Kelly Swamp. Unfortunately, the hooded plover breeding ecology sort of ends up sort of making them effectively, it really predisposes them to being really interfered with, and puts a massive amount of human-wildlife conflict into the way they operate and breed. So their nests, they're like really small, highly camouflaged eggs. So they're about the size of a quail egg on the beach in little scrapes, as you can see up here in the top left, and they're extremely well camouflaged, and obviously for people walking across the beach, etc., easy to just accidentally step on. They nest exclusively, at least the eastern subspecies, on open ocean beaches between August and March, with the very height and the most important part of their breeding season, when they're laying the most eggs, or the largest percentage of them are attempting to breed, is at the very height of summer between December and about February. And that's of course when people like to go to the beaches in droves, especially over that summer holiday period. And that's when the birds really get in trouble in terms of the failure rate of their nesting attempts. And this is made sort of compounded by, they're not like other birds in terms of, they're not like what we call altricial birds in terms of the chicks staying within the nest and having food brought to them once they hatch. The chicks actually have to get up and feed themselves. This works really well in terms of giving natural predators a bit of the runaround, because the chicks aren't confined to a single area, and they have an ability to escape from predators, a bit more of a predator avoidance strategy themselves as chicks. But it does mean that they're harder to manage from a management perspective, because just because they hatched from here, they can wander up to 1 kilometre, depending on the size of the breeding territory, and that makes any signage or fencing that any management aspects to help protect them really difficult to keep track of where the actual brood is going. On top of that, they actually take quite a long time to go from a newly hatched chick, which is about the size of a cotton ball, to an adult-sized bird that's capable of flying and escaping predators or human-related predators like domestic dogs, for example. So it takes about 35 days for them to go from a little fluffy chick to an adult bird, which when you think about it is really quick, but it's still a long time at the height of summer to be sort of flightless and relying on their parents for an indication of when to go and hide and when it's safe to come out and feed. And sort of as I was mentioning before, there's a lot of human-related threats, especially since Western colonisation, that are really impacting the birds' breeding. Everything from super abundant native predators. So as you can imagine, a lot of humans on the beach, a lot of human waste on the beach has led to large increases in native predators to hooded plover nests and young chicks, like gulls and ravens, and that really impacts their nesting success, along with sort of more direct human threats like the introduction of invasive species, domestic dogs, events on beaches, direct crushing, and especially on Eastern Maar Country more recently, the introduction or the emergence of commercial racehorse training on beaches, etc., really puts the poor hoodies up against it. In other states as well, off-road, it's not so much an issue on Eastern Maar Country, but in other parts of Australia, off-road driving on vehicles is a major threat to not only the breeding, but even the adult hooded plovers themselves. And what this ends up sort of coming down to is survival. The adults are actually sort of quite long-lived and sort of cluey, robust birds, and you can see from this this slide here, they have a really high year-to-year survival rate, with our oldest birds being over 20 years old, but most living, you know, around about sort of 10 or a bit over years, assuming they don't get knocked off by a predator. But just like other species, you know, turtles, if you have really low A, nest survival, and B, chick survival, what that ends up meaning is as those adult birds die off, you don't then have the next generation of birds coming through because they're not surviving through to become adults themselves, and that ends up meaning that there's a decrease in population size. And as you can see here, in biennial surveys from 1980 through to 2006, that's exactly what was occurring. Fortunately, in 2006, a program got up and running, the Beach Nesting Birds program, with the aim of improving breeding success through on-ground mitigation actions, research, behaviour change, and the identification and protection and restoration of habitat for the hooded plover. And this was sort of achieved through some research projects from 2006 to 2009, investigating the best ways to mitigate threats to the hooded plover, including the development of a best practice manual as to how land managers can help assist in the conservation of these species, especially when it comes to protecting the nest, and then helping to protect the chicks once the chicks emerge. So just quickly, I might fly through these last slides, but this program really comes on the back of the volunteers. We have volunteers that help monitor the birds, looking for flagged birds, fencing up, and with land managers helping to sign and fence nesting areas, as well as conducting surveys every 2 years. We also catch a small proportion of the birds that helps allow us determine, for example, how long are they living, where are they travelling to, and it was exactly this program that helped allow us to find that they can live up to 20 years. We also put cameras on nests in areas where there are high failure rates, and this allows us to determine exactly what's happening. Is it ravens? Is it the tide that's washing them out? Or is it a local cluey fox? We also develop a lot of engagement materials, and I'd particularly like to highlight the Fiona Clark, local Indigenous community member. We commissioned to do a really amazing hooded plover artwork. We initially aimed to have that to sort of spread the word about hooded plover connection to country over the past couple of years, but of course COVID has gotten in the way of that in terms of public engagement activities, as well as we do some work trying to remove some of the really invasive weeds and restore the habitat to its more natural setting. So just wrapping up, does all this work? Yes. So you can see the initial slow decrease in population leading up to the emergence of the program, and that rather than continuing to decrease, the population's actually sort of stabilised and in fact increased a little bit, which is a really amazing achievement, and a credit to all the volunteers who get out there on a day-to-day basis, getting out there, finding the breeding attempts, fencing them up, and we really need more volunteers to help this project going. So I encourage you all, if you are interested, to sign up to become involved. Thanks very much. Any questions for the 2 minutes that I've probably got left?
You've got about one, so you might need to put some of your questions, your answers into the chat when we finish. But there was the first one that came up that had a couple of likes, was just maybe to reiterate the number of hooded plovers, like the population in size overall and the population size estimate for Eastern Maar Country.
But Eastern Maar Country is about 100 individual birds, around about 50 breeding pairs. In Victoria, it's between, and this, they move about a bit, so between 600 and 700, because, state borders mean nothing to a bird. And the entire population of Australia is between 5,000 and 6,000 individuals, and that's about evenly split between the two subspecies. And we're actually working at the moment to try and get the Western subspecies listed, because they really suffer all the same threats. They're just a bit less picky about where they can breed.
Great, thanks, Dan. So I might give a little tip to Dan and other presenters, because I can see the chat's going to get really busy. So when you answer a question, if you hover over the question, a little toolbar will pop up, and the 3 dots on the right give you the option to reply to the question. And so that'll copy the question in to where you type your answer. And that way people will be able to see how your answers are connected to the questions. It might just help keep things a little tidier. Right, thank you so much, Dan. I'm now going to throw to me. So Lou is going to take over as timekeeper and be nice and strict with me. Thanks, Lou. We just made me host to start with, so Lou could be on IT support if she needed to. And it just means that she's going to have to play host for a moment. All right, let me know when that's up for people, Lou.
Yep, we can see that now, Rach.
Beautiful, thank you. So I'm here to give you an update on a talk I gave to the South West Biodiversity Forum 2 years ago. Around the orange-bellied parrot and some actions we were taking as a result of some decisions that we'd taken as a recovery team. So I wanted to start by just acknowledging that I'm talking about work that's relevant to the whole range of the orange-bellied parrot, which includes but is not limited to Eastern Maar Country. So I wanted to take a moment to pay my respects to the traditional owners of all of the country on which orange-bellied parrots occur, and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge that I get to be the storyteller today, but I'm actually sharing the achievements from some groups of people, one of which is the Orange-bellied Parrot Recovery Team, which is the longest running recovery team in Australia. And I'm really sharing a moment in time over what's been a really sustained effort. And also DELWP's Threatened Species Framework Team, which has developed the decision support tool that I'll be mentioning today. And I'm in both of those teams, which is how they sort of came together to do this piece of work. So this is really a story of how we got from hardly any orange-bellied parrots in the wild to this beautiful site taken last summer of a tree full of them. And that has occurred far quicker than I had have thought was possible. And it's hard to express how amazing that picture is to someone who's been working on this species for a period of time. So if you haven't heard me talk about orange-bellied parrots, I'll give you the really quick rundown. So they are a small migratory ground parrot. They're a little bit bigger than a budgie. They breed in the summer in remote southwest Tasmania in that black area, but have really declined to just breeding in one place in that area, a place called Melaleuca. In the autumn, they migrate north along the west coast of Tassie to spend autumn and winter along the coast of southeast mainland Australia. And in spring, they return back to that breeding site. They're one of the most critically endangered species in Australia, and over the last 10 years, for most of those years, only around 20 birds have returned to breed each year. Fortunately for them, we have a large captive breeding program that gives us birds to release into the wild and top up those numbers. The stars on the map show you where those institutions are, but they manage the captive population as one large population, and we have about 500 birds in that program at the moment. My other quick intro item is about the decision support tool that we used. It's called Specific Needs Assessment. This is a tool that DELWP has developed. It's a species-specific cost effectiveness tool. There's a spatial element because you can look at what might happen in different locations. It's mathematically comparable to strategic management prospects, or SMP, which some of you might be more familiar with. I'm not going to go into the detail of how it works today because we don't have time. If you want to know more about it, certainly get in touch with me after today and I can help you out there. So its benefit is that it's a structured, transparent way to include expert knowledge in our decision making and gives us the opportunity to include cost effectiveness among the many things we're considering when we make trade-off decisions between which course of action to take. It's a process that handles uncertainty well, which is really important when you're dealing with threatened species, and it can easily incorporate new information as it comes to hand, which again is useful when you're learning as you go, which is often what happens in threatened species management. I will take a moment to explain how we estimate the benefit of doing a management action, and that is that we ask a group of people who know the species reasonably well to estimate and look forward 50 years from now and think about what's the probability that species will still be in the wild or at a particular location in 50 years if we do no management, which is the Y on this graphic. And then we ask them what's the probability it will still be present in that location in 50 years if we do a management action or suite of management actions, which is the X here. And it's the difference between doing something and doing nothing is how we get a benefit estimate. And we can look at doing nothing, we can look at continuing the status quo, what we have been doing, and then we can compare that to any number of possible alternatives that we're interested in thinking about. So for orange-bellied parrots, this is our status quo. So what we were doing before we engaged with the specific needs assessment tool. We had a tiny wild population, as I said, about 20 adults most years. In 2016, we had an all-time low of only 3 wild females returning to breed. So they were very close to extinction in the wild and reliant on releases of those captive bred birds. In 2016, when we had that shocking return to the breeding site, the recovery team agreed to try 4 different release methods at once, hoping we could quickly identify what would be our most successful strategy. We simply didn't have time to try one thing for a few years, generate lots of data, decide if it was working or not, and then if it wasn't working, move on to the next thing, because if it didn't work, we probably would have lost them. So we had to sort of put our eggs in multiple baskets. So the different releases we tried were releasing adults in spring at the start of the breeding season, so there were more birds available for breeding. Topping up wild nests with captive hatched nestlings, particularly if wild nests had had egg hatching failures, so those wild parents had the chance to raise some young. Releasing juvenile captive birds late summer as soon as they were old enough to be separated from their captive parents and before migration, and then releasing birds on the mainland in autumn to try and attract migrants to sites that we thought were good quality sites. So from 2016 to 2019, the recovery team would decide how to allocate the birds we had available for release each year, or our bird budget, among these options through a facilitated discussion, and more or less we would usually agree on roughly equal allocations across these options because we weren't sure which things were going to work out best for us. So this slide's going to populate and become quite busy. It's a timeline of what we did from 2019 to now. So in May of 2019, through our normal process of having a discussion about how we allocate birds, we were starting to feel more positive about juvenile release based on the early results of trialling that method. And so we decided to increase our allocation of birds from 15 juveniles to 35. Some people wanted to go higher, but other people were worried that the results we had were based on small sample size. They weren't sure, so we landed on 35. We had our benefit estimation workshop for specific needs assessment the very next day, so there was no new information. We were just trying a different way to assess our options. And the specific needs assessment really looked at the allocation of release birds to the different release pathways. So in September, we had the report from specific needs because it took a while to sort of gather the costs of these complex management actions. And it showed that the recovery team really felt quite strongly that having about half of our release birds on the juvenile release pathway would be a really good idea. So the recovery team made a swift decision to put more birds into that pathway and increase our agreed allocation from 35 to 50 birds going out as juveniles. And the captive institutions quickly paired up more birds so we'd have those extra young to release. So we, using the tool, leaned harder in the direction that we were going to go anyway, because we were feeling more confident, just based on the decision support tool, not any other information. So in February of 2020, we released 49 juveniles in Tasmania, and they flocked with the young that were born in the wild that year. And that led to over 100 OBPs flying north on migration for the first time in over a decade. So that was exciting, but you know, half those birds were young ones we just released, so you have to wait and see what happens. Over winter, we had more OBPs seen in Victoria than in over a decade, despite the fact that COVID restrictions stopped most of our volunteers from being able to go out and survey. In spring, when they were returning to Tasmania, a remarkable 51 OBPs returned to the breeding site. So that's twice the number that returned the previous year and for most of the previous 10 years, and included 15 of those birds released as juveniles. So they absolutely could successfully make the round trip and come back. With more birds breeding, we observed the first ever expansion of the breeding range, and a record number of fledglings were produced. So I can't emphasise enough, we had birds start breeding in a place that has been monitored since 1980 but never used, and young birds in their first breeding season were choosing that as a place to breed. We had people band more baby OBPs in a day than they had done in entire seasons before. So when you're on to maybe a winner, you have another go. So we released another 50 juveniles in Tassie this February. They flocked with those 88 wild-born young and the adults that were ready to migrate, and almost 200 OBPs flew north on migration, so another new record. In winter, again, we were hampered a bit by COVID restrictions for their surveys, but South Australia had their first bird sighted for 8 years, and we had the first bird seen on the shoreline of northwestern Port Bay since 1984. So there's a hint they're expanding in their winter range as well. We're in the midst of return season now. It's kind of coming to a close, but we still expect more birds to arrive. So far, 58 OBPs have returned to breed this year, and we're preparing to release another 50 juveniles in this coming February. Another way to look at this story is by looking at some data. So here's a graph, I'll just explain quickly. We've got birds returning to the breeding ground in spring, the number of young produced, and then these navy bars are the number presumed to migrate north. There's some notes down the bottom there with some caveats around some of the other management actions we were doing in the meantime. But what I want to draw your attention to is these years with the stars, where the birds migrating north include around 50 released juveniles, and the returns and breeding success we had in the year that followed that first large migration that included a large number of juveniles. So we are now still waiting to see what will unfold this breeding season, but I'm really excited to see what another few years on this graph is going to look like. So to sum up, OBPs have been monitored since the year I was born because people were worried about them back then. And after 40 years of monitoring decline, we now are finally seeing that recovery is possible, and we're seeing things turn around for the first time ever. And that's possible because we took bold actions. We leaned harder into the things that had promise, and that was through a process that was informed by data and the collective wisdom of species experts, aided by a decision support tool that let them look at what they knew in a structured way. Specific needs assessment, I'll offer a plug for that because I work on the team that delivers that. It offers us a tool to make complex decisions in an inclusive manner and responding to new information and uncertainties as they unfold. And I'm absolutely sure that it has helped us on our journey towards the success that we're seeing in the field at the moment. And just a thank you again to the recovery team and the Threatened Species Framework team for all their work that's allowed this to occur. Thank you. I'm done.
Awesome, great. I think just a lot of props. Everyone's so excited to see. Yeah, good news story. It's lovely to hear.
Yeah, it's really it's amazing, and I do want to point out, you know, the specific needs assessment tool has been really useful and definitely helped us go into that with more confidence, but I also don't want to undersell the sustained work across the whole recovery program. because, you know, even saying let's suddenly release 50 juveniles, that doesn't happen without teams of people putting in an immense amount of work. And now we've got volunteers in Tassie who are struggling to identify all the OVPs that are returning because there's just too many of them turning up each day. So it's a beautiful thing. Do you want to, oh, hang on, there's one question there if I've got time. Have I got time?
I think we're right on 10:50.
I'll type your answer in later, Mark, because I shouldn't really be the reason that we're running late if I'm hosting the session. So I will type that in and I will throw to Colleen Hughson for also an update on a talk that was delivered at our forum a couple of years ago on her Better Buds campaign.
Okay, hopefully everyone can see that.
That's perfect.
So, yeah, in November of 2019, I presented on our, sorry, I think I've already gone one step two. There we are. On the issue of cotton buds, we're finding lots and lots of cotton buds littered on our beaches between Warrnambool and Port Fairy. And sorry, I should start off by saying Natanwa. Our project's taken place on Pikarong and Gunditjmara country in the Eastern Maar Nation, and where people have been living along the coastline sustainably for many years, like and hunting and living off the coast, and I guess, you know, since white colonisation and also the invention of plastic, we're seeing a lot of plastic washing up on our beaches, and not just the shells and the middens that were there previously. So so I presented at our first biodiversity forum in 2019, and at the time I told the audience that we wanted to ban the sale of plastic stem cotton buds in Australia. We saw that as a way forward to stop all these cotton buds washing up on our beaches. And I also said we wanted Warrnambool Water to upgrade their screens so that cotton buds could not escape into the ocean. And we wanted the EPA also to tighten the licence conditions to the water authorities so they could no longer discharge plastic into the ocean legally. And I just wanted to update you how far we got with that. So, okay. So we started our Better Buds campaign, officially actually launched it 2 days after I did that talk. We've so far collected 26,000 cotton buds off the beach. So we collect data record all our cleanups, and we've been doing so since 2017. And since then, we've been educating the public to not flush cotton buds down the toilet. We've successfully urged major retailers and manufacturers to stop the sale of plastic stem cotton buds and to switch to a sustainable alternative. We've successfully pushed Warrnambool Water to upgrade their screens at the wastewater plant, and we've successfully lobbied the state government for a ban on single-use plastic stem cotton buds as well. So just in the beginning, back in 2017, nobody had heard about cotton bud marine pollution, and that's including us. Cotton buds were not recognised by any state government in their waste or single-use plastic policies. Cotton buds were not recognised by any environmental groups lobbying on plastic pollution issues. They weren't recognised by any Australian Marine Conservatory groups as a problematic marine plastic. Cotton buds were not talked about in the media or social media. There were no alternatives to plastic cotton buds in any of the supermarkets in Australia. You could only get them at health food stores. And wastewater and ocean sewage outfalls were not recognised as a pathway for plastics to be discharged into the ocean in Australia. And flushing cotton buds down the toilet was a hidden litter issue. So we had a goal. We wanted to be the first, Warrnambool, to be the first city in Australia to ban plastic stem cotton buds. We were encouraging local residents to take a pledge to not use plastic cotton buds. We encourage local service industries such as beauty salons, vets, hospitals and medical clinics to stop using plastic stem cotton buds. And supermarkets, chemists and discount variety stores We wanted them firstly to actually provide a sustainable alternative so people had the choice, and then to also get rid of plastic completely in the long term. And we wanted all Warrnambool City Council owned facilities to provide sustainable alternatives as well, or use them. And we also had a national goal. We wanted to see plastic stem cotton buds banned in Australia, and we needed a bit of a strategy to do this. So we firstly we reached out to privately and publicly to retailers that sell and industries that use cotton buds, calling on them to move to sustainable alternatives. We harnessed public support in our campaign, getting people to make a pledge, getting people to sign a petition, and we lobbied the government. Lots of letters to the state government asking them to include plastic stem cotton buds as a single-use plastic item to ban in their waste policies. So back in December of 2019, we presented to the Warrnambool City Council our case, and they come on board, and they committed to removing plastic stem cotton buds from all Warrnambool City Council run facilities, and they also pledged to support our goal of making Warrnambool being the first city to ban cotton buds. And we partnered with Warrnambool East Primary School on our campaign and to implement, and we worked really closely with the school kids actually to come up with a campaign plan. They come up with the name Better Buds, one of the kids at the school, and they helped with writing, making posters, slogans, and movies, in an attempt to influence behaviour change. And obviously they're going back to their families and spreading the word that way. So this is just a little video. I'll play it for you that we made with the students at the school.
Is someone in your home flushing cotton buds down the toilet? Do you realise that when they flush cotton buds, they end up in the ocean? In Warrnambool, we collect 10,000 cotton buds a year off our beaches. That's a lot of cotton buds for our poor marine animals to choke on. Scientists have found whole cotton buds in turtles. Broken cotton buds have sharp edges that can stick in the throats and stomachs of fish and birds.
Plastic cotton buds are really bad buds to have around.
We can stop this disgusting plastic pollution happening on our beaches here in Australia right now.
We just need everyone to be better buds.
And by everyone, we mean you, industry, and government.
You can be a better bud by taking the Better Buds pledge.
It goes like this. I pledge to never buy or use plastic stemmed cotton buds, and I definitely won't flush them down the toilet. We don't have to use plastic to make cotton buds. We can make cotton buds better. There are plenty of sustainable alternatives that will break down in the sewage if someone inappropriately flushes them.
And these alternatives won't destroy our ocean or harm marine animals.
Cotton buds are a single-use plastic that can't be recycled. The UK, Europe, Scotland and New Zealand have all banned plastic cotton buds.
What is our Australian government doing on this issue?
We want our government to be better buds by taking responsibility for the damage plastic is doing to our ocean. We want them to ban single-use plastic and cotton buds. Be a better bud. Keep Australia beautiful, our oceans clean and our wildlife safe.
Oh, sorry. Okay, there we go. We also made a series of campaign materials, and you'll see then where we launched our campaign at the Replenish the Planet Festival in 2019. We made a giant cotton bud, but a lot of people thought it was a giant tampon, which is quite funny on the day. But yeah, and on that day we collected pledges with people that were at the festival. Also, the East Warrnambool Primary School took the campaign to the Melbourne Zoo back in November 2019 and presented it at the Fighting Extinctions Day. Presented it to over 20 schools, so that was a further way of spreading the message and the campaign to more people. We got over 491 individual pledges, and yeah, and as we spreaded the campaign through community markets, presentations at events. We had 18 media stories on our campaign in 2020, social media and content, and we created a website as well to provide information. We also got, we presented to Roma Britnell, and she was able to support our campaign and took it to state government as well, which was fantastic. And a local ABC ran a poll asking people if they were in favour of banning plastic stem cotton buds, and 97%, I see you there, sorry, I better wind up really quick. Okay, so great news is 2021, the state government banned plastic stem cotton buds. That's coming out in 2023, as well as the New South Wales government and Western Australia. And I'm going to go really quickly. There is our petition. Johnson & Johnson's were the first company to switch their whole range to paper stems. And all of the actual major supermarkets have all stopped selling plastic. So I am going to go really quick. The EPA tightened the license agreement, so they can no longer discharge plastic in the ocean.
You've got 5 more minutes if you want to use it.
Okay, this is our beach now. We went from 2017 to 2020, and that was the difference with putting better screens in the wastewater treatment plant, so the cotton buds weren't escaping. And how does this relate to biodiversity? So stopping cotton buds washing up on the beaches benefits the marine environment and decreases the risk of harm to marine animals and ultimately to humans. So I am going to questions now. Sorry about that. All right. I don't know if I've got any questions.
That's okay. You mostly have people saying that you're fabulous, the kids are fabulous, it's all wonderful and great job. Do you want to take a moment to go back to those the graphic showing which shops now have changed what they stock? Because you rushed through that, and that's probably interesting to see. Yeah, sure. So we've got, so that's 2018. Target was the first one to introduce sugarcane, and then in 2019, Swispers and Kmart introduced an alternative. Then in 2020, you got Coles, Aldi and Kmart. They all took plastic off their shelves, and this is 2021. So you've only really got Swispers and Real Care. They still give you, plastic as well as an alternative. And the only places, actually this year, the Reject Shop has taken off plastic as well. So that was lots of hounding that went on for a number of years before we actually launched our campaign officially at the end of 2019, because we wanted to go have that national audience. So we needed a campaign name and all that jazz. So yeah. A couple of questions have popped up. So there's one there. Are we still finding buds on the beach? And yeah, unfortunately, I guess the reason why it was really important to get that ban put in place is because I guess in our area we have 3 sewage outfalls. We've got Warrnambool, which was, I guess, the main offender that was washing up, cotton buds were washing up from that, but then there's also Port Fairy sewage outfall in Portland. So since the new screens have been put in, we've still collected 6,000 cotton buds. That's along the Belfast Coastal Reserve. So, and a lot of our plastic actually comes from the west. So we imagine that that's where that it's still being released, because those screens on those other plants aren't that, the diameter of the holes aren't that small to contain the cotton buds. So it is still a problem, and that's why the ban's really, really important, because all the outfalls around Australia, they're all different. They've all got different screens, and we find cotton buds on all of our cleanups.
every time I go to the beach, I'll find a cotton bud, which is that. And then that's why we focused on that. There's plenty of other things we pick up. We pick up all sorts of stuff off the beach, but because we're finding cotton buds all the time, we decided to focus on that as an issue, work on that, and then probably move on to something else. Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much, Colleen. That was great.
Nice to see using cotton buds was all right. Shall I just answer these? Sorry.
Yeah, so you can just type your answers in. We might give people a break. As we're due for our break. So I think Lou's going to put up a slide to remind people when to be back, but I've got us coming back at 11:15. So yeah, Colleen, if you can just type into the chat your answers to the few questions that sort of came up in the last couple of minutes there. And thanks everybody who presented. That was great. Yeah, go have a stretch, have a cuppa, and we'll see you all back here at 11:15. And Lou will be taking over as your host for the second session today.
I think that's given everyone plenty of time to join us again. So Nyata, everybody, as we learnt this morning, welcome. My name's Louise Falls. I work for DELWP's Natural Environment Program team in the South West region, and I'll be hosting the second part of the session today. You may have seen my name on a lot of emails that I've sent out about this forum in the last few months, so it's wonderful to see you all joining us here today. I want to start by acknowledging that I'm coming to you from Eastern Maar Country, specifically the country of the Gadabanud peoples, and I'd like to pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to any First Nations people who might be with us today, and to thank Billy and Paul for their wonderful introduction and for reminding us of the importance of working on the country that we all do. So first up is Mark Garkaklis, so I'll hand over to you, Mark.
Thank you, Louise. And this is really going to be interesting because I'm not in control of my slides, which is a very good thing. It should happen more often. My name's Mark Garkaklis. I'm an ecologist. I've been working in conservation management at all sorts of levels around Australia and overseas for many years. Currently, Barb Wilson and myself are involved closely with the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority under the Wild Otways initiative. And we are working with our colleagues, a number of different groups of colleagues in the management of an introduced plant pathogen to Australia, Phytophthora cinnamomi, and the epidemic of disease that it causes, Phytophthora dieback. I'd just like to acknowledge I'm coming to you at the moment from Eastern Maar Country. I'm down in Gellibrand. This project covers areas of Eastern Maar and Wadawurrung Country, and I'd like to acknowledge elders past, present and emerging. My colleagues on this project are Terry Walsh from the University of Melbourne. Quite a few of you will know. Dustin Bridges, our remote sensing data engineers, of great service to us here, Barb Wilson, and all of our colleagues at the Corangamite Catchment Management Authority, especially the spatial analysts teams and Robin organising us on this project. Today, I'm talking to you about one sub-project of the Phytophthora project, which is looking at the selection of priority areas for management of the disease. In brief, in this talk, I'll just briefly go over what is Phytophthora dieback, talk quickly about Phytophthora dieback in the Otway ranges, and also give you a couple of photos of the expression of Phytophthora dieback disease right now. I'll talk briefly about the National Threat Abatement Plan for Phytophthora dieback. That's the mechanism through which we're acting. We've got legislation and policy and process which guides us on why we invest and what we're doing. And briefly go over some of the objectives of the National Threat Abatement Plan. Really, objective 1 is the critical one, which is in relation to this talk, which is the identification of those areas that are really priority for protection from the disease. And just talk about how we're going through that process of identification of priority protection areas in the Otway ranges under the Wild Otways initiative. And Amy, if you hit the right-hand button, it should just go to the next slide. There we go. Phytophthora dieback was introduced as a function of European settlement in Australia. It's an introduced plant pathogen. It is a disease that can move from one place to the other it's a pathogen that can move from one place to the other in the environment through the movement of infested soil or water. Once it's in an area where it can attack susceptible plant species, you get an epidemic of disease outbreak that we call Phytophthora dieback. So that's the disease that we're dealing with. It kills many Australian native plant species, grass trees, banksias, isopogons, grevilleas, eucalypts, agricultural plants like avocados. You can get Phytophthora root rot in roses, so you can get it in your garden. The pathogen is an algae-like water mold. So it's not a fungus. Excuse me, I'm going to have a drink, a coffee. It's not a fungus. It's a water mold, and water is perhaps some of the key to its movement in the landscape, and it's also the key to the expression of the disease Phytophthora dieback. Phytophthora may not kill plants, but if you talk to Dave Cale from Deakin University, he'll tell you every single plant reacts to Phytophthora. Everything reacts to Phytophthora cinnamomi. If it's killed by it, it has an inability to react to that pathogen. If it's not killed by it, it's walling itself off and it is actually defending itself from that pathogen. Some plants are killed by the pathogen, some are not. But even plants that are not killed can lose their vigour. And so we don't just look at the susceptible plant species that are killed by the pathogen. We're also looking at those that may reduce in their productive output. Next slide, thanks, Amy. To give you an idea of what you can experience in any one time, just a reminder that one of the things that affects the disease expression in Phytophthora is climate. And our climate in Victoria is very fluid. Phytophthora pathogens love warm, wet environments. That graph on the left-hand side is called a Hughson control chart, and it's from data from Mount Gambier, and it's from 1943 up until current. But cunningly, what has been set in that Hughson control chart are a few control limits that says, I'm happy when the average temperature is sitting between those control limits. I'm unhappy if I start to see my line trend away from those control limits. Now, in terms of an average temperature for Mount Gambier, if it was between 1943 to 1963, I would want my annual temperature to be somewhere in between those two red marks. In 1963, it actually breached immediately those temperature limits, and it's continuing to rise. What it's showing us is that our temperatures are going up. It's getting warmer. In a year like this year, and just this week, the Bureau of Meteorology have confirmed a La Nina. Warm, wet environments lead to disease expression. Next slide, thanks, Amy. This is the dieback disease that we're currently witnessing. On the left-hand side is some disease expression in the Carlisle Heath. This is near Peppermint Parade, where we've got clearly visible fronts of disease that are killing grass trees. On the right-hand side is number 2 road in the Eastern Otways, and these are just clear dieback fronts. This is classic disease expression. And this year is perhaps as aggressive as Barb and myself have witnessed. Up next slide, thanks. But we have a guidance to help us, and that guidance, that umbrella for Australia, is the National Threat Abatement Plan for diseases caused by the plant pathogen Phytophthora cinnamomi. And that's actually the document that has helped framing our initial decisions about what it is we're doing with regard to Phytophthora pathogen and how we might go about managing that. So the Phytophthora dieback is a threatening process, key threatening process that's listed under the EPBC Act. That gives us the imprimatur to do stuff to try and manage it. And because we have this threat abatement plan, we have a set of guidelines that are being implemented in other jurisdictions to help us manage the pathogen and help manage the disease epidemic. Next slide, thanks, Amy. And actually, if you read the document, it's only 20 pages, so you can get your head around how wide-ranging, but also area-specific the National Threat Abatement Plan is. If you go to page 6 of the Threat Abatement Plan, the Anglesey Heath and the Great Otway National Park are specifically mentioned as areas that are at risk from Phytophthora dieback. It's really important to note that the National Threat Abatement Plan identifies biodiversity values that are at significant risk from this disease. But in addition, the National Threat Abatement Plan has acknowledged also that although it's not a specific matter of national environmental significance, in other words, it doesn't necessarily trigger the EPBC Act, the Threat Abatement Plan recognises that a number of Indigenous lands are affected by Phytophthora dieback, where culturally important values such as grass trees are impacted. And that's a really important specific statement from the Threat Abatement Plan. Next slide, thanks, Amy. The epidemic of disease and the fact we had the Threat Abatement Plan means that the federal government has a mechanism by which it can invest in Phytophthora dieback management. And that has been the motivator for the Project 3 of the Australian Government's Wild Otways initiative, which is the overall initiative is a $6 million investment into management of a bunch of EPBC Act related management issues in the Otways region. Next slide, thanks, Amy. And one of the primary management interventions under the Wild Otways initiative is this particular project, Project 3, and the first action following the National Threat Abatement Plan is to first identify areas within the investment region which are priority areas for protection of Phytophthora dieback. And so that's the process that we're actually going through at the moment. Next slide, thanks, Amy. And our Wild Otways team have been working with the land managers in the region in an effort to focus in towards these priority protection areas. Land managers within the region have the knowledge about where assets are, they have the data sets. We bring in specialist experts as well, and there's been opportunities to have workshops to consider where areas for priority investment are in that area of interest of the Wild Otways initiative. Next slide, thanks, Amy. Data sets that are available are wide-ranging and geospatial. This one here is from the DELWP Nature Kit, which is a threat of Phytophthora dieback expression. And it's just one of the data sets that was used by the team to consider where they believe the best investment for Phytophthora management would be. Have the next slide, thanks, Amy. The outcomes so far, and we're halfway through this process, 2/3 of the way through this process, is that we've hit on with the team 7 draft Phytophthora management priority protection areas. And these are uninfested heathlands of the Devondale Road area, which is in Lower Gellibrand. There's the area Mount Mackenzie to Egan's Track areas in the west of the Otways. Carlisle Heathlands, which is between Gellibrand and Carlisle. Porcupine Reference Area, an area that's really interesting between Gellibrand and Forest. Forest Yorga area. the Salt Creek Complex in Anglesey Heath in Anglesey, and the Tallestelia Protection Area. I've got a couple of slides to go, Louise, and we're nearly there. We're at the stage where we're actually doing I've got our draft mapping together for each of those PPAs, and we're up to the stage of actually making investment decisions. You can go to the next slide. Thanks, Amy. This is PPA 1, where we're looking at those areas of really susceptible vegetation community. And if you can go to the next slide, we're getting an understanding of where our management costing alternatives might be within each of those PPAs. And in fact, our next set of workshops is happening very soon. And it's this data that Terry is help facilitating us with that will allow us to look at some of the trade-offs that Rachel just brilliantly talked of when she was talking about the orange-bellied parrot stuff earlier today. And I think I've got those next steps here. Ultimately, we'll be producing a draft threat abatement and action plan for the Otways. And finally, Louise, these are the people who are really providing knowledge. Parks Victoria and DELWP, FFM Vic, are the primary land managers and have a lot of drive and provide us great direction with where we're going. Our colleagues at the Conservation Ecology Centre are heavily involved in the Wild Otways projects as well. And just finally, when we do finish this priority protection area assessment process, it's important to know that our group, our people who are working here at the moment, will be the second jurisdiction in Australia to have gone through that objective of the National Threat Abatement Plan, which I think would be a fantastic outcome. Thanks, Louise.
Thanks so much, Mark. And I just had a quick question, actually, for all of us working in this landscape and in the Otways National Park. What do you recommend is the best way to be in the bush to prevent phyto from spreading?
The Phytophthora, I think, spreads when people aren't mindful. So if you haven't had any exposure or experience to Phytophthora dieback, then you may blunder your way into the bush and inadvertently spread it. The most important thing I find, regardless of all of the tools we're given, is that if everyone in the team is mindful, it's part of your toolkit every morning before you do your safety checks. This is a Phytophthora susceptible area. If we move infested soil or water in doing our work, we'll have moved the pathogen. So what we must do is not move infested soil or water. And that's the first part of that OH&S toolbox reminder every day. I find that really important. It's a great question. It's the ultimate question.
It helps to know that there's something we can do. Wonderful. Thanks so much for your time, Mark. And I don't know if there's any questions at the moment, but feel free to put questions in the chat, everybody, if you have any for Mark. And we'll now hand over to Aggie Stevenson from Glenelg Hopkins CMA to talk about restoring forgotten woodlands. So over to you, Aggie.
Thank you very much, Louise. I'll just share my screen. Now, is that coming up how it was in the test this morning, Louise?
So we've got your PowerPoint, but it's not on slideshow mode. So if you just start the slideshow.
Okay.
Perfect. Now we can see everything.
Great. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to present today. And this is really weird not being able to see people. But I think 2 years ago, I presented on the work we've been doing with the button wrinklewort. And I wanted to present on work we're doing through the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands, but I think hearing from me twice in one forum might be a bit much. So I managed to get this one in for this forum instead. So I am a member of this amazing friends group called the Friends of the Forgotten Woodlands, who were set up back in, we started in 2015, I think it was. And this was as a result of one particularly amazing landholder who doesn't like being named, but I'll just call him Bill, coming to me and voicing concerns over the fact that we're seeing these really important keystone woodland species on the volcanic plains starting to disappear. So these being the silver banksia, trooping she oak, and sweet bosseria. There's other woodland species as well that we're looking at, but these are the three real kickers. And when I say disappearing, they're still doing really well on adjoining bioregions, so the Dundas Tablelands, Glenelg Plain, but just on the VVP, they're just really dropping out. So I'll just take you through some quick slides to show examples of from early explorers and some words from early explorers of what the landscape used to look like. And you can see here in this picture, this is mainly scattered she oak and banksia on this hill we're looking at here. But and I'm sure you can read for yourselves, but these quotes from Robinson in 1841, it was a beautiful undulating country covered with dwarf banksias, gums and cherry tree, under umbrageous branches of two fine banksia. And I won't read all these, but you can go and, you know, have a read of these. And, you know, the next Howitt's quote talking about the sheacs are thinly scattered over these verdant plains. And then we go on to see more quotes from the Mary Creek catchment, remembering that the volcanic plains does stretch right into Melbourne. The dogs in continual excitement with the noises of vast numbers of parrots, paraquets and wattlebirds, which were feasting on the honey of the banksia flowers. And the country is green as the fields of England. Banksias are now handsome, for their foliage is fresh and they are studded all over with thin, bright yellow bottle brushes. We've decided that the banksia is a preraphyllite tree and would look formally beautiful in one of the pictures of that school. And I probably pronounced that wrong, but you can just, you know, get a feeling for, you know, that these areas, the volcanic plains, wasn't just a treeless grassland, but we did have these scattered beautiful woodland trees. And just a couple more pictures. I'm just trying to sort of set the scene of what once existed, and hence us thinking we need to do something. So now here is a map that Steve Sinclair from the Arthur Riley Institute put together. This is a bit of a hobby of Steve's, doing this sort of work. But you can see the main thing we're looking at on this map is just the circles showing the locations of the she oak and the honeysuckle and what he calls wattles, blackwoods and the cherry, so the cherry ballarts. Note that these are taken from recordings from 1837 to 1898. So something I hadn't realised, but honey in areas where eucalypts weren't the dominant tree, often the honeysuckles or the banksias were used as blaze trees, so markers to mark out corners of titles when they were first, I suppose, being drawn up. And that's how Steve has pulled a lot of this information together. That's a whole presentation on its own that Steve has done before, and I'm sure we'll do again. But this just gives you a bit of a picture of where they occurred. So one of the first things we did as a group in 2015 was have a workshop, and we sat down and we invited people from right across the volcanic plains, from landholders to scientists, researchers, enthusiasts, and said, right, draw on maps where you know that there are remnants of these three species. And this is what we came up with, this distribution. So we had a pretty good idea of, and these were on private and public land, these remnants. So now just very quickly, we all know what these three beautiful plants look like, but I'm just giving you a picture of, I suppose, you know, to give you a bit of an idea of just what sort of peril they're in. And we'll talk numbers shortly. But first, our beautiful silver banksia. You can see from the poor old fella on the left, he's especially looking pretty tragic. But these are all generally single isolated plants that can't really do an awful lot on their own. And then we have a gorgeous sweet Bosseria. So we've got a very healthy one here on the left, and these do get really big. But then this absolutely amazing one that's near Stoneleigh, we can see here on it growing on a rocky outcrop. So still hanging in there. And then of course our beautiful drooping she oak. So again, in this one on the right, this is at Mount Hamilton, and there's really not many around at all. So what are we doing? Why are we doing this? As I say, we recognise there was a really large gap in where these species are still occurring, but really our first big step was realising that we didn't know much about the genetic health and diversity of banksia especially. Linda Broadhurst had done some work previously on she oak in the Corangamite region, so we sort of knew we had a little bit of an understanding there. So Deakin University, so Adam Miller, with a bit of help from CSIRO, led a study where we collected leaf samples from approximately 12 of the larger VVP populations of Banksia. And this was done to determine the reproductive connectedness of remnant populations scattered across the plains and looking at their relative genetic condition. So this work has really helped identify genetically fit seed sources for the development of seed production areas, and also to identify populations that are really lacking in genetic diversity and are really in need of a genetic reinforcement. And I'll talk a little bit about that later, but basically augmenting populations that are pretty rocky. So in a nutshell, the findings from this was that there is no connectedness between Banksia remnants across the volcanic plains. They are all isolated. Whilst the genetic diversity within each of these isolated remnants is pretty good, but really they're on a pretty slippery trajectory. So the moral of this is, without intervention, the Banksias of the VVP would be doomed. So we've really acted just in the nick of time. And Adam Miller says that to be genetically fit for any remnant population of woody species, you need a minimum of 500 plants and for longevity of that species. And the only population out of any of these three species is a population of Banksia on Colton's Road. And however, that's sadly declining as we speak. So that would suggest that when we started this, there is only one viable population of these three species, which is a bit scary. Okay, so I'm going to go through just a few photos, but just some stats to date since the group started in 2015, but work started in 2014. We've got 92 people involved. We've got approximately 12,000 trees planted since 2014. Around 10,000 of these so far are GPS mapped with known provenances recorded of each individual plant. And generally our sites are pretty well split between private and public land, which is really important. So this picture, this is of, I think, putting in our very first SPA of, so SPA being seed production area for Banksias. We've got 7 SPAs so far. So 3 of these are at Dunkeld, 3 are at Mount Elephant, and we've got 1 Banksia SPA at Stoneleigh. Overall, with our seed orchard sites included, which are a mixed species planting, we've got them over about 19 geographic areas, but that's 31 orchards. So if there's a few plantings within an area, we talk about that being 1 geographic location. All these SPAs, it's really important to note that 20% of the 500 plants that we put in each SPA are climate matched and working to the 2080 I suppose, predictions. So this means that a couple of times we have taken species that have not originated from the VVP, but that's been a necessity. So we are making sure that we're introducing genetics from a drier climate. And my understanding is that while a lot of people talk about doing this, it's not happened so much yet. So that's pretty exciting. So the SPAs, these will act as security populations. They'll be a source of optimal seed for maximising fitness and adaptive potential in restored populations for future plantings. And it's also really going to help take the guesswork out of providing trees suitable for planting across the VVP into the future. As I say, we've talked about the 20%, and just an idea of some of the places that we've got, because we have SPAs for each of the 3 species. We've had plants from Euroa, Smeatum, Jilpanga, Tuberak, Benalla, Groke, Denoli. So we really have stretched far and wide, but this has all been done with a very good science base behind it. And I suppose a really important message out of this is we can't keep relying on our remnants to keep going and taking seed, because we're overusing them as they are. We know that they're declining, so we really need to get these seed production areas up and running so we can relieve the pressure on our remnants. Okay, so as I said, the seed orchard sites, we generally mix the 3 species, the Banksia, Bassarea and She Oak. sometimes we introduce a few other species, some wattles, calitris, tree violet and bottlebrush. And next year we'll be putting some clematis microphylla in as well. And just, I suppose, I'm getting into volunteers. Our group would not work without the absolutely amazing volunteers that we have. This year alone, we've had 11 working bees, sorry. We tried to guesstimate how many working bees we've had since we began, and Bill and I just couldn't work it out. But it's pretty nuts how many people come out of the woodwork to plant trees. Provenance is a really key thing. As I mentioned, we did all that mapping to work out where the remnants are. I did have the number of provenances of each species up on the individual slides, but there's 30 provenances for Banksia, 35 for She Oak and 45 for Bosseria. So we now know we've sort of got to not think about only using plants from within a certain sort of 10 to 15 kilometres. We know that is not the case for these species. We need to stretch further afield if we want these guys to keep going. And we have noticed over the years that the seedling germination and vigour from isolated Banksias and She Oaks tends to be lower than those from, you know, sort of big healthier populations.
Sorry, Aggie, it's Louise here. We'll probably just have to wrap up in a minute or so. We've got a few key slides that you'd like to show.
I'll fly through some pictures now.
Awesome, thank you.
Okay, sorry. This is our mapping that we've been doing. So these next 4 slides will show, this shows where we've got them all GPSed. And then we zoom in here to Mount Sturgeon. Then we zoom in a little bit more. Each dot's a tree. And then you can click on each tree and it will tell you information. So provenance, how many times, if we've had to replace that plant and so on. This is just a great drone footage of the 3 contiguous SPAs at Mount Elephant, which are doing really well. We've done great, some drought tolerance trials at Deakin University, which I don't have time to talk about. I will just make the point, it's really important the whole time we've been going as a group, bring the science in, making sure we've got the researchers involved, and so our key committee members are from universities and Arthur Ryler, and you know, it's really important that we bring in all that knowledge. We've run forums and lots of information sessions. This one we actually, our first Banksia Day, we didn't even realise, but we held it on Sir Joseph Banks' birthday on the 24th of February, which was a bit quirky. But yeah, look, we've just done lots of great stuff. Our volunteers, we've had lots and lots of help from the CMAs, both Corangamite and Glenelg Hopkins, through working for Victoria crews, through helping get funding for the Banksia genetics. We've had lots of grants from the Victorian government, so Bogger grants, we're on, I think, our 3rd. We've had a Wannon grant to help us do work. So we've been very fortunate to have a great group of people helping us. And now I'll finish on this, and this is in fear of missing out on a logo, but you can see from just these few logos alone, it's a really well supported program that we're running, and we're really grateful to everyone's support. So thank you very much.
Awesome, thanks so much, Aggie. I loved those photos. There are some amazing trees. I'm used to seeing Bosseria at about head height and cursing while I'm getting stabbed by the spines, but nothing like that. They're amazing. And it just goes to show what a volunteer group can do, and a few enthusiastic people with all of those working bees and all of those trees planted. Yeah, it's amazing to see. So thanks so much for sharing.
Thank you.
I think there might be a few comments and questions in the chat for you if you're happy to answer them. And yeah, we might head to the next presentation. So I'd like to introduce Tamika Farley Lehmer from the Conservation Ecology Centre. So yeah, whenever you're ready to share your screen, go for it.
All right. Right, is that good?
Yes, running now, go.
All right, great. Well, hello, my name is Tamika, and the project that I'm going to be presenting about today was done on Garkaklis country. So I would just like to acknowledge them as the traditional owners, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. So I'm going to be talking about my current project at the Conservation and Ecology Centre, which is focused around striking that balance between conservation and bushfire risk. I once read an article titled, "There's only one way to make a bushfire less powerful. You take out the stuff that burns." A simple notion really, and potentially probably a little bit too simple, but alas, it is stuck around inside my head. And maybe that's because the reality of more extreme weather events due to global warming is knocking on our front door and has recently been seared into our minds by the 2019-2020 Black Summer of Fire. And as someone who was on the front lines during this time, I find that I can't help but crave that simple solution and neat answer to making a bushfire less powerful, just so I don't have to see that kind of devastation again. And to me, this title kind of summarizes that neat, simple understanding of how fuel hazard reduction burning works. I mean, in its simplest form, what it's really about, taking out the stuff that burns. So you take out the leaf litter, the bark, the thatch, and the dead material, and hence you can knock out a corner of that fire triangle, and in a perfect world, you can prevent a bushfire from sustaining itself. And so that's really the, I guess, thought that underpins fuel hazard reduction burning. But that's where its simplicity ends, because in reality, you need to be thinking about things like how often do we burn to maintain reduced fuel loads, how much do we burn to have landscape scale impacts, what season do we burn in to reach fuel management zone coverage targets. And that's by no means an exhaustive list, but already it's starting to paint a pretty complex picture of what a successful, well-rounded fuel hazard management plan looks like. The other side of the prescribed burning coin is the ecological costs and benefits. A lot of us already know that many Australian species have adapted to fire. In fact, in order to maintain biodiversity, many ecosystems actually crave it when it's done right. And similar to fuel hazard management, in order to successfully use fire for ecological benefits, there are some key considerations that we really need to be thinking about. But as your objectives change, so too do the answers to the questions that we're asking. And I think, at least historically, that's why ecological burning and fuel hazard reduction burning have been treated as mutually exclusive, as though one can only occur at the cost of the other, because they have different answers to the same questions. But why shouldn't we be striving to marry the two, tackling both fuel management and ecological conservation within the one well-informed burning regime? And so that's really the thought that underpins this whole project, to not just focus on the conservation aspect, but also to find a way to effectively manage forest fuel loads, to try and strike that balance between the two. So with that in mind, our focal area is one of the main heathlands found within the Otway region, the Carlisle Heath. So the Carlisle is one of the last strongholds for several small mammals, such as the long-nosed potteroo or the southern brown bandicoot, a fact which makes it of great ecological significance. It's also one of the region's greatest exposures to catastrophic bushfire due to a high frequency of lightning strikes and its highly flammable vegetation type due to species like Xanthria or the grass tree. So probably no surprise then, being such a flammable vegetation, that it also has quite a rich fire history. So large-scale fire events usually come through the Carlisle every 20 to 30 years, and in between that, there's still smaller-scale bushfires, as well as a planned burning program kind of operating in there as well. And despite all of this fire, there's still some pretty thick vegetation when you're out in the Carlisle, and this thick vegetation, one, leads to high fuel loads, and two, also provides a pretty complex small mammal habitat. This complex habitat structure, due to the thick vegetation, is thought to be one of the reasons why small mammals can persist at such high levels here, despite no control program currently being underway in this region. A fact that I think really adds to the importance of nailing a fuel management program within this flammable system. So now that we can all agree that the Carlisle is a small mammal rich tinderbox, I want to talk a little bit about our approach to intertwining flora and fauna management with an operational field management program. So what that means is that we need more information about the ecological side of the project and more information about the field hazard management side of the project. So one approach is to identify how effective a burn regime is at reducing the impact of bushfires. And one way of doing that is through fire behaviour modelling. So fire behaviour modelling can simulate the extent and the intensity of wildfire under various burn regimes. And traditionally, here in Victoria at least, we use Phoenix Rapid Fire, which can simulate a single fire event under predetermined conditions. But the question that we're trying to really ask in this project is more around how effective different planned burning strategies are at reducing the impacts or the risk of bushfires over time. And so to address this temporal element in collaboration with Trent Penman's lab at Melbourne University, we're using the Fire Regime Operations Simulation Tool, or FROST. So FROST is a fire regime tool based off of Phoenix. So instead of just modelling a single fire event, FROST can actually model many fires, both planned burn and wildfires, and it can show how they interact with not just each other, but also interact with the landscape over a designated time period. And the reason we're so focused on planned burning is because planned burning is just one of the many factors at play when you talk about mitigating the risk of bushfires, but it is the easiest factor for land managers to manipulate. And so it's therefore important that we tease out the impact that different planned burning strategies, so that is playing around with things like how much do we burn or how often do we burn, is a great way for understanding the influence that I guess these planned burning strategies can have at preventing wildfire. So we've constructed 4 different planned burning strategies, the first of which is no fire management occurs within the Carlisle Heath, the second being high coverage burns occur in practice, so around 70% coverage within burn blocks. Then we've got a middle ground, which is 55% coverage of available fuels consumed in burn blocks, and then a low coverage burn, which is around 40% of available fuels consumed. And once we identified these 4 different scenarios, we can then begin to simulate them and see how they influence the wildfire season, so that summer season, over time. To give you an example of the kind of outputs you can get from FROST, I've got one pictured below where the black outline is the Carlisle Heath region outline, and this output depicts fire frequency within the landscape over a 100-year simulation under no planned burning program. So the blue indicates areas of low fire frequency and the red indicates areas of high fire frequency, or areas which are more vulnerable to wildfire because they see it more often over the 100-year simulation. In comparison, I have the same plot, but this time the 100-year simulation included the high coverage burn scenario that I talked about earlier, where the red hashed area indicates the designated burn blocks. So the first thing you're probably going to notice is that if I just flip back to the no burn program, no planned burning going on to the high coverage burns, is that at least within the burn blocks, fire frequency has reduced. But the point that I really want to draw your attention to is around what happens when we start tweaking with the different levers around planned burning, and then if we can play around with the different coverages, we can see how does that impact fire frequency. So looking towards the future, we really want to combine both the field management side of this project that we've been working on with that conservation aspect. So what we're going to do is take those fire behaviour outputs, so things like burn frequency or burn extent and fire intensity, and incorporate them into a population viability analysis as a disturbance event. So a population viability analysis, or a PPA, is a way of assessing the risk that a population will go extinct in X number of years. And currently we're also completing a whole bunch of fieldwork out in Carlisle based around the Potteroo. So we're hoping to take some of this information about the population dynamics of the Potteroo that we've been gathering and incorporate that into our PVA to better inform the population dynamics of our model. So it's going to have some real world application for the Carlisle. So once we've built our PPA, we can incorporate that fire behaviour outputs as a disturbance event into the PPA. And what that means is we can then use those fire disturbance to see how that impacts the potoroos habitat and how find a way to gauge how long it takes for that disturbance event to, I guess, impact the potoroos population to the point where it can cause the population to crash. So that can give us some pretty good information about threshold points of how much disturbance a potoroo population can handle due to fire. And once we have that information, we can incorporate it back into what's best practice for managing fuel loads and then paint a well-informed picture. So stepping away from the little charismatic potoroos and the modelling stuff, the other side to the fauna equation is the flora. So traditionally, most of the burning in the Carlisle was done either in summer as wildfire or in spring and autumn as planned burning. But the current project is kind of more focused around doing winter burning. So it's important to us that we're also observing how this new winter burning and this different type of fire impacts the landscape and the flora specifically. So we're running some vegetation surveys for the burn blocks next year, and they're currently in the works. We don't have results yet, but hopefully that way we're also having a whole inclusive image of what's happening in the Carlisle with this new burning program. So I just want to say that it's pretty undeniable that fire has a very important role here in the Australian land, management, both for biodiversity and to manage the increasing threat of bushfires. But we're still working to understand what this management kind of looks like at that finer scale. And so my parting comment is this: plants and animals will tell us what they need if we listen. And through this project, we are really trying to listen. So thank you, or Tool, I believe it is.
Nailed it. Thanks so much, Tam. Well done. There's a few questions in the chat for you. We might have time for a couple of them. So Billy, who spoke this morning, has asked whether the burnings had any involvement with traditional owners, and if so, what that sort of looked like so far.
Yeah, so I know that they came along to one of the burns, the first one that we did this year, and they were, I guess they were on the lighting crew with us, so we were just walking through the bush with them, showing them what's being done and things like that. They are involved in the project, but I think there's still discussions around how much involvement they want to have and things. But yeah, we're definitely engaging with them and asking for their opinions on the topic.
Wonderful, thank you. And along the similar lines, Jordan's asked if the work's being supported by DELWP at all.
Yeah, so all of the burning is in collaboration with Forest Fire Management. So they're the ones conducting the burns, and we're actually really fortunate that they've been really open and receptive to letting us perform our research and incorporating our research into how they do the burning. So yeah, it's a really big collaboration effort. It's great.
Awesome. Thanks, Tam. I think that's all the questions for now. So yeah, thanks for sharing and for letting us know of your experience over 2019, 2020. So thanks so much. I'll now hand over to Mark Laplar, who's going to talk to us about potoroos in the Carlisle Heath. So over to you, Mark.
All right. Let me just fire this up. Okay, so I'm here to talk to you guys, I guess, about the fauna side of the equation. Tam talked really well then, I guess, about the importance of managing fire in a range of landscapes, both, you know, to reduce fuel risk, but also to ideally get some positive ecological outcomes. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm talking to you today from Garkaklis country, and all of the work that I'm talking about has been this massive collaborative effort between the CEC team, the University of Melbourne, the Corangamite CMA, and the FFM-Vic. So, you know, I get the fortunate chance to present about it, but it's a big group effort and it's a wild ride. So here we go. Fire's a game changer. It's really no surprise that a post-fire environment is fundamentally different for the species that live there. Often when fire comes through, it's going to simplify the structural vegetation And how much that vegetation may change or become simplified really depends on how intense the fire was, how big it was, and how complex it was in the first place. But in effect, post-fire environments very, very different. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that, fire may have negative outcomes for individual species, but there will be winners and losers from this sort of disturbance. It's a fundamental ecological process in Australia. And, a good example of a positive outcome for a fire, wild or planned, may be perhaps to promote a mass flowering event of grass trees like we saw in the Carlisle after a wildfire in 2019-2020. And it's certainly positive for invasive species. They love post-fire environments, which we're about to see in just a little bit. The theory here is pretty intuitive, pretty straightforward, and it's summed up quite eloquently in this little figure from Bron Hradsky's recent review on the topic. In effect, post-fire environments, again, being a simplified environment, it may lead to predators either being more successful, so having a higher per capita predation rate, or perhaps attracting new individuals into that post-burn environment. So you may have, an increase in activity or abundance or both. And really the outcome there, unfortunately, is a negative one for the native mammals that are able to survive the fire. So there's a real interaction going on there. And with that in mind, I'll take you to the Carlisle Heath. Tam sums it up really well. It is quite a stronghold for a range of different species that we know are declining elsewhere. So species like the southern brown bandicoot, the swamp antechinus, white-footed dunnart, they all live up there. And it's a really tricky environment to manage in the context of fire because it's incredibly flammable country. Even in winter, fires in this sort of country can really get going, and that's primarily due to the, that dense stand of grass trees that really characterise the region. One of the great things about the Carlisle is we know there is a very, very healthy population of potoroos that still call that area home. We've been doing some work over the past couple of years, a bit of camera trapping, and these guys are showing up really consistently. And so we decided we wanted to investigate a few years back a little bit more about how these animals are responding to current fire practices in the Otway Ranges, primarily because we knew they were healthy and we knew we could catch them. With the support of the Herman Slade Foundation, we were able to actually pursue a research program that uses GPS collars to really track individual animals before, during, and after the burn. Now, these collars are quite small and technology can still be a bit of a limiting factor, but the collars we're able to use gives us about a 6-week deployment length if we ask those collars to collect information on where potoroos are every single hour throughout the day. And we didn't have enough collars to sort of also include a control population, a population of potoroos where they're just bouncing around, not exposed to fire to compare to. So it is primarily a before and after experiment. So just keep that in mind. We've been able to do this burn or this research at a couple of different burns, 4 burns so far over the last 2 years. What we can see on the right is an image of the pre-fire movement data for all of the potoroos that have been exposed to fire. They're moving around the landscape. This is where they were before the fire occurred. 2 of the fires we were able to investigate last year. One included 2 potoroos and another included 4 potoroos. And if you pick up in later slides that some of these potoroos are named after certain characters, it's because I watched Grease Lightning before we started this work and decided to name them all after Grease Lightning characters for all the potoroos from 2020. We're able to repeat the work again in these 2 areas, again in the Carlisle, with Harry Potter charactered potoroos this time, and a bit more replication, so we're able to build on our success last year and really get this work going. So what have we found so far? Well, fortunately, all of the potoroos appear to have survived the initial fire event, which is great. It means they certainly have the right behaviours to deal with fire moving through the landscape. We didn't find any charred potoroos or any evidence to suggest that they were negatively impacted by the fire itself. However, unfortunately, of the 20 potoroos that had been exposed to fire, only 4 of them have actually survived long enough to require us to go out there, recapture them and remove those colours. So only 4 have survived up to 4 weeks post-fire in total. When this mortality has occurred, it's been really variable, and I think that's an important point which I'll demonstrate in the next couple of slides. So it's a consistent outcome in terms of overall mortality, but it's not a consistent outcome in terms of when these animals are being picked off post-fire. So this is an example of one of the fires from 2020. Along the bottom, we can see a little bit of a scale of, how many days post-fire. And if you look on those maps, you'll see those little shapes. That's where these individual animals were using the landscape before the fire came in. Unfortunately, at this burn, all 4 of these collared potoroos were picked off within about 5 days. So immediately after the fire, really starting to see that negative impact. And I can sort of explain what we think might be happening in just a little bit. One of the fires from this year, again, the shape showing where they were before the fire, it appeared as if we would lose a potoroo about once a week. So rather than all of them, dying immediately after fire really, really quickly, this one appeared to be a case by, death by 1,000 cuts a little bit. So losing about a potoroo a week intermittently up to about 40 days post-fire. And then a final example here of where most of the potoroos actually survived for about 3 or 4 weeks after the fire. And at this stage, we were being really, really hopeful, thinking maybe what we saw in a couple of other burns may have just been a bit of bad luck. But unfortunately, over the course of about a 7-day period after that 3 or 4 weeks post-fire, all 4 of these animals succumbed to predation as well. And I say succumbed because we've managed to collect some pretty strong evidence that foxes are probably driving a lot of this predation impact that we've seen. So, for example, 2 of our collared potoroos have actually been found cached, which is a classic fox behaviour. And for those who don't know, this is when a fox is having such a good time catching food that they'll actually catch some food and bury it and save it for later. So we found 2 of our potoroos actually buried underground with their GPS collars still attached. Again, quite a classic fox behaviour. We've also undertaken some concurrent camera trap monitoring at all of these sites, and it would appear as if we've actually captured a predation event of one of our collared potoroos on camera by a fox as well. Mad Eye Moody, this poor little potoroo in the fox's jaws there, was last known alive at 11 p.m, quite close to where this camera trap was. Half an hour later, this image was taken, and we know from some accelerometer data and temperature data on those GPS loggers that unfortunately Mad Eye Moody died at some point during that hour. And again, backed up a little bit by some more frequent detections of foxes using burnt landscapes. We do detect them pre-fire as well, but certainly detecting them far more frequently post-fire. Another outcome that we've seen with the potoroos is that they show really strong fidelity to their pre-fire home range, regardless of how much of it actually burnt. So with these images on the left, on the right here, the dotted lines are their pre-fire home range and the solid lines are their post-fire home range. And as you can see, these shapes are effectively the same and in the same areas. What this shows is that they're effectively using the same areas overall as they were before the fire, regardless of how much of them burnt. Voldemort there in the orange, most of his home range is actually burnt, yet he's still using that same area. And that's a real bummer because it means this period of heightened vulnerability post-fire, where they're running around and using the burnt landscape, it may actually be a bit longer than anticipated. All of these animals were still moving around and using the burnt landscape up to 4 weeks post-fire. So it might not be a case of having a bit of a time lag for these animals to realise, hey, I probably shouldn't spend much time in the burn area. It's pretty dangerous. Maybe I should move my home range. For whatever reason, they're still sticking around. And again, this is demonstrated a little bit by Voldemort, affectionately named because he managed to take a nice bite out of our colleague Emma's finger as we attach his GPS collar. The green points are his pre-fire home range movements. The red points are his post-fire home range movements. We can see a rough outline of the burn there. He's still living in the same area. And again, backed up, this is behaviour that we're not seeing just with our collared potoroos. We're seeing it with uncollared potoroos that are occurring in the same area as well. So they are going out and they are making themselves a little bit more vulnerable by using a burnt landscape. And there's potentially a reason. The fungi that potoroos seem to really, really love digging up, or at least one of the types of them, is called mesophilia. And there may be some evidence that fire may, promote some more growth of this fungi or make it more accessible for the potoroos to get at. So that fire coming through and reducing all that vegetation might make it a bit easier for them to access this fungi. So we think perhaps there's a little bit of weighing up the pros and cons and the risks going on the potoroo's behalf, where they think perhaps going in there and exploiting this newly available food resource may be worth that increased risk of predation. Couple of points just to finish. I don't want anyone to walk away thinking this is an entirely horrible thing, you know, that we should stop burning or whatsoever. As Tam mentioned, you know, this is country that needs to be managed, and fire is an integral part. The heathland does need fire. We just need to figure out how to do it in the right way. And potoroo populations likely can deal with some level of predation. They breed multiple times throughout the year. Potentially they could recover quite quickly. And I think it's important to note that going into every fire and expecting perhaps a 0% mortality, that's probably going to be an unrealistic expectation or a goal that we'll probably never meet. But I definitely think there's room for improvement. And there's a couple of different things that we're looking at, again, in close collaboration with Forest Fire Management Victoria, things that we may be able to change or add on to how we do fire in a Carlisle that might improve the survival of this species. One of the things we're looking at is perhaps deliberately going in there and attempting to produce patchier burn scars. So burn scars, you know, that perhaps provide a little bit more movement pathways and immediate access to refugia if potoroos feel threatened or are pursued by a predator using the burnt landscape. Or perhaps we're looking at integrating some short-term and localized lethal control of invasive predators like cats and foxes to perhaps nullify that interaction from the outset and take them out of the equation before we put fire into the landscape. And finally, this research is just ramping up. Next year, we're going to build on it. All things going to plan. We're going to have GPS-collared foxes and cats in the same area as well. So that same level of detail about how potoroos are moving in the landscape before and after fire, ideally, we'll also have that same information for resident cats and foxes. And that's going to be this wonderful story to tell about how all of these different animals are using the landscape. There's more work going on about sort of analysing the camera trap data as well, because potoroos are just a proxy. Okay, so we're not going to use, we're not going to assume what happens to the potoroos happens to every other species in the Carlisle. It'd be nice to have a look at species-specific responses to fire as well. And finally, there's a Masters project coming online, which is going to go back into some of these burn blocks where we did have a few animals survive and see if they're still there. So fingers crossed, survival in the long term, or survival in the short term means survival in the long term. And again, finally, it's just been a huge group effort. And yeah, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have.
Thanks for that, Mark. We'll probably only have time for one quick question. So there was one from Yvonne asking, does this suggest you should not be using baited cameras? I think that was maybe a bit earlier on your presentation. Yeah,
totally. It's something that I've thought about a little bit as well, is, oh God, are we perhaps making them a little bit more vulnerable by providing an attractant into a burnt landscape to improve detections? After thinking about it for some time, I think it really depends on how effective you think that lure is in terms of bringing animals in. My gut feeling after working, I guess, with this technology and this approach for some time is that the lure can be quite good, but probably only acts at quite a small scale. So I think it perhaps may encourage animals to come in front of the camera from maybe up to 10, 15 meters away. It's not going to be bringing animals from the burn edge hundreds of meters into the burn area and putting them at risk. So I do think regardless of whether or not these cameras were baited or not, these animals would be using the landscape. And I guess that's backed up a little bit by the movement data because, you know, they're still moving around, you know, even not where cameras are baited, etc. But it's a very, very good question.
Thank you. And there's quite a few questions coming in at the moment, so you might have to jump into the chat to answer a few of those. So thank you, Mark. And I'd now like to introduce Barbara Wilson, who's going to talk to us about refuges in the Carlisle Heath. So I don't know if you're there, Barb. And we had a few tech difficulties this morning, so if you could share your presentation.
I have. Is that showing?
It might just take a second. It's a bit of a blank screen. Yep, there we go. It just needs to be in slideshow mode.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Barb.
Thanks, Louise. Yes, well, maybe I don't need an introduction. It's been fantastic to have the previous presentations on the Carlisle Heath. But I'd like to talk to you today about the broader mammal community in the Carlisle Heath and the role of the Carlisle Heath as a refuge for mammals. So I'd like to acknowledge all of my collaborators. The work we've done has been supported by DELWP, Parks Vic, Deakin University and Corangamite CMA and the Australian government. So why are we doing this work? Well, between 2013 and 18, We resurveyed a lot of study sites that we worked on for many decades and found huge declines in small mammals in the eastern Otways. For example, we did not catch any New Holland mouse, no captures at all. The swamp antechinus was absent from 17 sites where it had been recorded before, and we only recorded 8 individuals. The woodland sites were particularly low in their presentation or representation of mammals. So there was low success. There was no mammals at a huge percentage of sites, whereas previously they were species rich. The only good point was that we found in coastal dunes and gullies, there was still some high abundance of mammals and that they were species rich. So we identified those as really important refuges. And the reasons we think is they are high in moisture, high in vegetation cover, and perhaps they're higher in nutrients, and there is an absence in fire. So these are crucial in the Eastern Otways for protection. So we were looking in, oops, sorry, how's that? We were looking in these heathlands in Anglesey, and then we moved our attention to the Carlisle Heathlands. And as stated, the Carlisle Heath's about 11,000 hectares, and it's in the Great Otway National Park. Previously, there'd been a few broad studies of mammals. There'd been some regional surveys, but there were significant species that had been recorded there, including the swamp antechinus, spotted quoll, hasn't been recorded for a long time. And of course, the long-nosed potteroo and bandicoot, which Mark has talked about. So the aims of this work was to characterise the small mammal communities and the potential for the area as a refuge for the Otways. We wanted to determine the species abundance and the distribution across the landscape, and any influence of the topography or the ecological vegetation communities. In particular, we are interested in the difference between the wet heathlands that occur downslope, and they showed up in Mark's photos also, and the heathy woodlands that occur upslope. And we had a big focus on the swamp antechinus because it's an endangered species. One thing to keep in mind is the mean annual rainfall for this area is 873 millimetres. So it's an area that has wet habitat, it has flow through gullies, and it has good rainfall. In 2019-20, we used camera trapping and Elliott trapping, and we concentrated our trapping upslope and downslope to see if there are any differences in the wetter areas and the dry heathy woodlands up here. And we also did some work in an unburnt refuge that occurred in a fuel reduction burn. We had high trap success in the gullies, so areas like this wet heath, 11%, areas like Rapier Ridge and the Old Carlisle Track, and low trap success upslope, 2%. We did catch a variety of mammals, agile antechinus. We did catch swamp antechinus at a few sites, bush rats and swamp rats. The cameras, we of course recorded the bigger mammals, so the wallabies, the potteroos, bush rats, southern brown bandicoot and Antechinus swansoni. And at some sites we did catch some individuals at only one site, things like the feathertail glider and pygmy possums and white-footed dunnart. So they were rare. So, and we did find swamp antechinus and dusky antechinus in these unburnt refuges. So it was important because the species that currently are absent or depauperate in the Eastern Otways are present in Carlisle. But how present are they and what are the populations like? This year, we undertook a trapping survey. Kristen Agosta, our honours student from Deakin, undertook a trapping survey so we could get more population data. And in this case, she put her traps in the wet heathland and the heathy woodland, and looked at also the differences in time since fire. And these sites cover a range from 1 to 82 years. She undertook trapping between April and June at 40 sites, 24 traps per site and 4 nights. This is the distribution of those trapping sites. So I'm just going to look at the abundance of mammals at these sites. So these are the 40 sites along here. And these are divided, the records, captures per 100 trap nights into the marsupials up here, rodents here, and introduced rodents here. So yes, indeed, we had great success with trap captures for swamp antechinus. That's the red one's here. Agile antechinus, more common in the heathy woodlands, and very few captures of pygmy possums and Antechinus swansoni. Bush rats and swamp rats are pretty common right across, and actually introduced rodents were pretty common right across. Interestingly, the captures in the EVCs, we divided this eventually into the wet heathlands and the heathy woodlands, but we had some areas that we called ecotones because they had representation of both of these. And the captures of both natives and total captures were higher in these ecotones. Interestingly, the native species trap success was much higher in the 10 to 20 and 20 plus vegetation communities as compared to those more recently burned, the 0 to 9 years. And if we have a look at the captures of and the mean trap success of Eastern Otways versus the Carlisle, which is of interest, this is the Eastern Otways, this is heathy woodland, so this is heathy woodland and Carlisle. In our earlier trapping between 1975 and 2007, we had a mean success of 33. This shows that decrease in the recent years down to 4. In the Carlisle, it was 13.8, so it's medium compared to the original data in the heathy woodlands. The other area, which is our refuges, the coastal scrub dunes in the Otways, has very high abundance, in very high, 52.5. It had declined, but it was still quite good. The wet heath in the Carlisle is about 12%, 12.7, and the wet heathy woodland ecotone is 21. So Carlisle is doing well. It's no better than the Eastern Otways were before climate change kicked in. Information about swamp antechinus is really essential. This is looking at the number of individuals, the percentage of males and females at each of the sites. Interestingly, we only captured 19 females and 58 males. That's most unusual. All of the animals were in breeding condition. They had developed testes and pouches, and they were at 27 sites, and trap success was 5.7%, which is quite good. There were higher capture rates, again, for swamp antechinus in the ecotone. And if we look at the changes in fire, swamp antechinus definitely prefers the older vegetation type. And that complies with all of the data we've had in the Eastern Otways over the years. So just in conclusion, that there is very high species richness and abundance of the small and medium-sized mammals. There's high occurrence and abundance of swamp antechinus. It's likely that the habitats in the Carlisle Heath are very productive. As I said, 873 millimetres of rainfall, whereas in the Eastern Otways, we're only looking at about 600. There's also these gullies and watercourses that might be more buffering about drought, and there's a possibility of that capturing more nutrients. So this preliminary stuff tells us that the driver of diversity and abundance for small mammals is definitely length of time since fire, and species are found in these unburnt refuges. So Carlisle Heath does, yes indeed, represent a key macro refuge for mammals in Otways, and the occurrence of species that are currently depauperate in the Eastern Otways. The threats, already been mentioned today, which is great to hear. One that hasn't is the presence of, well, Mark talked about it earlier on, one that has is the presence of dieback, which is having a huge impact on the structure of the vegetation. And we know structure and cover are protective of small mammals from predators. Wildfire is obviously a threat. It removes the vegetation. This is a wildfire from the year before last. Prescribed burning, if it's too frequent, may be a threat. And winter burns are a real problem for swamp antechinus because they breed in winter. And so the only animals you have left after breeding are females with pouch young. So winter burning threatens the reproduction of the swamp antechinus. So yes, predators, there's much more resilience if you have vegetative cover. And that's much more protective. So thinking about the types of burning is really important. And yes, climate change possibly hasn't had as great an impact in the Carlisle as it has in the Eastern Otways. But if the predictions are correct and we are going to this higher temperature, higher fire frequency, those things could change. So thank you very much. Oh.
Did you want to talk on that last one?
Well, just briefly, I didn't actually, but the rain decline in the millennial drought was very large in the Eastern Otways, particularly the accumulative rain decline. So it's not just the year, but it's how much you get over the period that impacts on the mammals. Yeah. So I can leave it there. Thanks, Louise.
Wonderful. Thanks, Barb. And there's a question in the chat that Mark put down that I think a few of us have, whether you had any thoughts on what's driving the gender bias in the swamp antechinus trapping to have so many males to a little number of females.
Yeah, it is very interesting because it is quite different. We in the Eastern Otways, we pretty well 50-50. I guess we can say that it was breeding time, and the females are they stay in their territories. The males at breeding time move a lot. So some of those females, I think that's their territory, and they're multiple maters. So the males come in and they all want to mate with the females. So that's possibly what's going on. The males are possibly coming in from other areas and coming to the core habitat areas that the females are maintaining. Yeah.
Yep, totally makes sense. They're such antechinus are such weird, awesome animals. And there's one other question from Tracy, which I think sort of applies to the last couple of presentations, which is, will these findings change the response to wildfire and planned burns in the Otways to protect threatened species?
Well, this project is part of the Wild Otways initiative, and we are working strongly with Parks Vic and DELWP to input this information into their planned burning. So all of this information on all of the different species, it's a challenge because Mark's talked about the loss of the potoroos. How much loss is significant? We'd have to look at the same thing with swamp antechinus. What level of loss can you tolerate to maintain the species? So maybe the others would like to comment if you have time.
We might have to put some comments in the chat for that one.
Thanks.
I think.
Yeah.
And yeah, we'll leave the chat open for the last couple of minutes just while I wrap things up. So I'll have a go too. Well, thank you to all of our presenters today for your time and for your amazing talks. It's been wonderful to hear in this area that we all live and work what's happening. It's so inspiring. And it's been fantastic to see in the chat the requests for meetings and email addresses and updates. That's exactly what we want out of a forum like today, is to make those connections and to hear about work that you can be involved in and contribute towards. So thank you to everyone for attending as well. Special thanks go to Billy and Paul from Eastern Maar Aboriginal Corporation for your time this morning and also your assistance with getting today together in terms of what you'd like to see and what's important to Eastern Maar. It's been wonderful working with you. I have to shout out to the NEP team. There's been quite a few people helping behind the scenes, both today and on our first session on Tuesday. So a big thank you to Amy Jackson, Laura Prentice, Peter Lawson for hosting, Saul Vermeeren for hosting, and a few other members of the team for their moderation and help. So for everybody, there will be a Survey Monkey where we'll be looking for some feedback. So fingers crossed, we'll be having another forum soon, but in person, which would be wonderful. So your feedback's really important to let us know what you'd like to see and what you'd like to get out of it. What we want these forums to be is what the community would like them to be. So please put in any ideas that you have. And also the recording for both sessions will become available quite soon. So they'll be emailed out to everyone who has attended and registered on Eventbrite, and they'll also be loaded to the Swift webpage as well. So feel free to share them far and wide. If there's someone that you know who missed out on attending but would like to see the presentations, please share them as much as possible. So there's a few more things coming through in the chat, but I think that's everything that I have on my end. So with that, I'll say thank you everybody for attending, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks very much.